Did you know Irish mythology played a central role in the plot of Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy 2, The Golden Army, Nuada, Balor? Those are two hugely significant characters from Irish mythology's redundantly named mythological cycle. And as you're about to discover, characters and narratives from all 4 cycles of Irish mythology have permeated pop culture in one way or another, even if you didn't realize it. You know, I think there's a case to be made that Irish folklore represents the first real reflections of Irish mythology in popular culture. W.B. Yeats has this great line in his 1888 work, Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, when the pagan gods of Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann, robbed of worship and offerings, grew smaller and smaller in the popular imagination until they turned into the fairies, the pagan heroes grew bigger and bigger until they turned into the giants. End quote. We see this phenomenon with a figure like Fionn Mac Cool, anglicized as Finn McCool, the human-sized chief hero of Irish mythology's Fenian cycle, who is reimagined in Irish folklore as a giant who builds the Giant's Causeway on the coast of County Antrim so he can meet a rival Scottish giant in battle, and who incidentally creates the Isle of Man after hurling a chunk of land at said rival giant but missing. Whoopsie. We also see this phenomenon going in the other direction with supernatural beings like leprechauns and banshees, Irish figures with mythical and arguably divine roots that have degraded, in the popular imagination, into little monsters. But enough about the monsters, I can hear you yelling. You're always making videos about these friggin' Irish monsters. Just give us what we're all clamoring for. More W.B. Yeats. Talk about his epic poem from 1889, The Wanderings of Oisin, which deals directly with the mythical meanderings of Fionn Mac Cool's son. And how could I not name drop Irish folklorist Lady Gregory and her seminal 1904 retelling of the mythological and Fenian cycles, which she titled Gods and Fighting Men, as well as her 1902 retelling of the Ulster cycle, titled Cuchulainn of Merhemna, in reference to that cycle's chief hero. There's also T.W. Rolleston's robust and wonderfully illustrated Myths and Legends of the Celtic Race from 1911, which features stories from all 4 cycles and beyond. See, some stories, like the Voyage of Bran, don't fit neatly into any cycle, and some scholars argue we shouldn't even bother with the 4 cycles classification system, instead organizing tales by type, like voyages, battles, cattle raids, destructions, pursuits, etc. But I digress. We've also got figures like the Irish poet and folklorist Alfred Percival Graves, father of Robert Graves, remember that for later, and a bit further back, the Irish poet and folklorist Lady Jane Francesca Agnes Wilde, mother of Oscar Wilde, both of whom helped promote interest in the sharing, preservation, and resurfacing of old Irish stories. These contributions were part of a broader movement, or really a series of movements, known collectively as the Celtic Revival, which admittedly has its fair share of controversial contributions courtesy of figures like James McPherson of Scotland and Edward Williams, aka Iolo Morganwg of Wales, both of whom may or may not have been literary forgers. They were. But hey, without all of these contributions to the Celtic Revival, the American pulp writer Robert E. Howard might not have, in 1932, come up with the character Conan the Barbarian. First appearing in Weird Tales magazine, Conan belongs to the fictional Cimmerian race, which really should be pronounced Cimmerian with a hard C, but who am I to judge considering I spent a whole video mispronouncing Cernunnos. Cernunnos. In Howard's lore, in his Hyborian age, the Cimmerians are the ancestors of the Gaels, i.e. the Gaelic aka Goidelic Celtic speakers of Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. And by Crom, you better believe that the god Conan swears to is named after the Crom Cruach idol of Irish legend, the idol that gives the Irish High King Tiernas one heck of a time until St. Patrick intervenes. Then there's Conan himself, who may have earned his moniker from the lippy Fenian cycle warrior Conan MacMorna, aka Conan Moya, the Bald. Of course, when the first issue of the comic book Savage Tales, featuring Conan the Barbarian, dropped in 1971, luscious locks were the order of the era. And they were still the order of the era in 1982, when the Arnold Schwarzenegger starring sword and sorcery film Conan the Barbarian made its debut. And in 1984, when the sequel Conan the Destroyer dropped. And in 1985, when we got the quasi-sequel Red Sonja. And in 1997, when Hercules was in that spin-off Kull the Conqueror. And most certainly in 2011 when Jason Momoa took the reins of the reboot. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here, because it was in 2008 that the Guillermo del Toro directed Hellboy 2: The Golden Army introduced audiences to Prince Nuada Silverlance, a riff on Nuada of the Silver Arm or Hand, who in the myths leads Ireland's divine tribe, the Tuatha Dé Danann, until he loses a limb in battle, and King Balor, who is a riff on the Fomorian leader, Balor of the Evil Eye, but clearly a loose riff because in the movie it is Balor who has the metal appendage, not the dude whose mythical epithet is of the Silver Arm. And Balor and Nuada are portrayed as father and son in the movie, which isn't the case in the myths. And they give Balor antlers like the Gaulish Celtic god Cernunnos, which fine, but when you're starting with Balor of the Evil Eye, aka Balor of the Piercing Eye, the eye being a reference to the character's giant venomous eye that can incinerate countrysides, you'd think you'd want to do something with that. Unless Guillermo del Toro was trying to avoid comparisons to another villainous character from another franchise who was also based on Balor. More on that later. Despite not sticking closely to the mythological source material, Hellboy 2 does at least acknowledge the Irish roots of the aforementioned characters, and even sets a pivotal scene at the Giant's Causeway. It's like Hollywood imitating folklore, imitating mythology. Or something. For better or worse, the 1959 Disney-produced fantasy film Darby O'Gill and the Little People, starring Scottish actor Sean Connery, may well have been how many Americans were introduced to Irish mythology. True, there was that Leprechaun movie, The Luck of the Irish, that came out a decade earlier, and another Leprechaun movie, Finian's Rainbow, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, that would come out a decade later, and of course those Leprechaun films of the 90s and beyond. But Darby O'Gill stands apart, not just because of the incredible special effects it employs to showcase its titular little people, but also because it presents said little people, who resemble the wee folk known as the Phelan from the Ulster cycle, in conjunction with a host of other mythical and legendary Irish figures, including a banshee, the Irish headless horseman the Dullahan, who may have had a hand, head, an inspiring Sleepy Hollow's craniumless cavalryman, and a shape-shifting puka masquerading as a horse, as pukas are wont to do. But the truth is, most movies that borrow from Irish mythology tend to home in on one single type of supernatural Irish being. Take Selkies, for example. 1994's The Secret of Roan Inish, 2001's The Seventh Stream, 2009's Ondine, 2009's The Shine of Rainbows, 2014's Song of the Sea. All of these Irish films concern themselves with Selkies, supernatural creatures that can switch between seal and human forms. Granted, the Academy Award-nominated Song of the Sea, which is an absolute masterpiece, mind you, also features plenty of nods to the Irish gods, the Tuatha Dé Danann, with characters like Lugh, the god of many talents in the myths, and Lear, as in Manannán mac Lir, the Irish sea god. And the movie's main villain is Macha, a goddess from the myths whom many scholars consider to be an incarnation of the Morrigan, a battle goddess who regularly takes the form of a crow or raven on the battlefield. She has also been interpreted as a triple or triune goddess, taking on 3 distinct personalities and or forms. Speaking of taking on different forms, 2019's The Hole in the Ground and 2021's You Are Not My Mother are both Irish horror films that deal with malicious shapeshifters known as changelings. There's a case to be made that 2024's The Watchers falls into this changeling camp as well, but without giving too much away, there are also references to the Tuatha Dé Danann in the film and how they're a fallen divine race now forced to live in underground burrows. 2009's Academy Award nominated The Secret of Kells, which is from the same creative team that would go on to make Song of the Sea, also features a shape-shifting fairy in the forest character, but that's not really what the movie is about. And by Crom, you'll never guess which evil idol / ancient Irish god makes an appearance in The Secret of Kells. It's Crom Cruach. And hey, while we're talking about The Secret of Kells and Song of the Sea, both the brainchildren of Irish filmmaker and Cartoon Saloon co-founder Tom Moore, we should absolutely give a shout out to the third film in Moore's so-called Irish folklore trilogy, Wolfwalkers, from 2020, which was also nominated for an Academy Award. According to Moore, the inspiration for Wolfwalkers came from the lycanthropy-filled Irish folktale The Man-Wolves of Ossory, which was featured in Gerald of Wales's 12th century work Topographia Hibernica, or Topography of Ireland. A tradition associated with that folktale is that the Man-Wolves, or Wolfwalkers, are actually descendants of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Sticking with animated features, 2021's Riverdance, the animated adventure, and 2022's Luck probably deserve quick mentions for having tangential connections to Irish myths and legends, but a case could be made that 2010's Scooby-Doo Abracadabra-Doo is actually more faithful to the source material. Of course, none of these hold a candle to the 1981 cult classic Fairies, which is based on a Fenian cycle myth that follows Niamh Hin Or, golden-haired, of Tír na nÓg, and her love interest, Fionn MacCool's son, Oisin. And yes, this is the same source material W.B. Yeats used for his epic poem, The Wanderings of Oisin. Now, let's make a hard left turn back to horror. In 2020, boys from County Hell resurrected the Irish legend of Aurtach for the silver screen. Aurtach, the infamous Irish vampire, or Niamh Marv, Walking Dead, was a bloodthirsty chieftain who could only be killed by way of wooden sword stabbing followed by an upside-down burial, or so the story goes. He was the likely inspiration for Irish author Bram Stoker's character, Dracula. Dracula may indeed be the most widely popular / culturally significant character to emerge from Irish myth and legend. Although I'm sure Merlin and King Arthur would have something to say about that. There are so many connection points between Irish mythology and Arthurian legend that I have a whole playlist of videos dedicated to its exploration. But I think a good example to mention here is the chivalric romance Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, a tale that bears more than a striking resemblance to the older Ulster cycle myth, Brickrew's Feast. The challenge, the head chop, the knight scooping up his severed head, the journey, staying in a castle with some dude's wife, that dude turning out to be the knight who challenged you to the beheading game in the first place, that's all from Brickrew's Feast. An incredible film adaptation of this Irish myth-inspired Arthurian legend, The Green Knight, came out in 2021, and you'll never guess where it was filmed. Ireland. On the small screen, 1997's Roar, starring Heath Ledger and Vera Farmiga as early 5th century Irish warriors keen on keeping the Roman Empire at bay, may have been the first bit of pop culture to introduce me to the idea of a hard C Celtic culture, which is very different from the soft C Celtics culture of my native land. Although to be fair, both Roar and Boston feature lots of people pretending to be Irish. Over the course of its single season, Roar introduced us to several characters with ties to Irish mythology, including Cullen, who in the myths is the namesake of the Ulster Cycle's chief hero, Cú Chulainn, the Hound of Cullen, who is born Setanta, but then he kills Cullen's guard dog with a hurley and takes the dog's job. It's a tale as old as time. Also in Roar, we see a riff on Brigid, the Irish goddess of poetry, fertility, and smithing, amongst other things, who is associated with hearth fires and torches. Hence, it's not all that surprising that in the show, they made Brigid a fire sprite. Flash forward 20 years, and American Gods, which kicked off in 2017, has a recurring character named Mad Sweeney. He is a leprechaun, only taller. And he's a sun god, I guess? And his superpower is making gold coins appear. Alright. The name is a nod to the Irish king, Sevna Mac Colnan, and to one of, if not the most popular Irish myths in the cycle of kings, Boile Hevna, the frenzy or madness of Sweeney. Like so many other Celtic madmen of the woods, including Mervyn, Merlin, Lelokin, it's a whole Celtic folklore motif thing, Sweeney flees a battlefield and lives in nature. He's rocking in the treetops all day long. The character in American Gods, however, seems more inspired by the Irish god of many talents, Lugh, a major hero / deity from the chronologically earlier mythological cycle. The show's Sweeney is described as a, quote, god of the sun, of luck, of craft, art, of everything valuable to civilization, the shining one, end quote. Yeah, that's Lugh LOTR, Lugh of the long arm or long throw, a god who, in the Ca Moitura, Second Battle of Moitura, is mistaken for the sun on account of his brightness, his radiant face in particular. And to be fair, going with the whole leprechaun angle does make sense in a way, at least if you subscribe to the etymological theory that the word leprechaun is an anglicization of the Irish Lugh Chroman, Little Stooping Lugh. To quote historian Peter Beresford Ellis, who is clearly channeling W.B. Yeats, over the years this mighty god's image diminished in popular folk memory until he became simply a fairy craftsman, end quote. I shall now give a quick tip of the hat to Bodkin, both for its focus on the mythically significant Gaelic festival of Samhain, the cross-quarter day that helped pave the way for modern Halloween, and for its inclusion of a wolf named Fuela, which in Irish legend is a specific type of werewolf that serves as a guardian or protector. And I have it on good authority that there is a short story from 2018 titled The Fuela by Patrick Winters that explores this lethal Irish protector werewolf characterization. What was that? Why yes, that story is featured in the Celtic fantasy anthology Neon Druid that I put together. Anyway, turns out the Fuela is nothing like the bitey Irish werewolves that appear in the 2002 Emerald Isle set episode of The Mummy, the animated series, titled Howl. And while I'm sure I could dig up other one-off TV episodes that incorporate Irish myth and legend in some fashion, I think we can all agree that that time would be better served talking about the Irish Power Rangers. The Mystic Knights of Tír na nÓg made their grand entrance in 1998 on the Fox Kids network, and made their grand exit in 1999. So if you've never heard of them, that's why. Created by Saban Entertainment, the same company behind Power Rangers, the Mystic Knights of Tír na nÓg pulls its backstory directly from the Ulster cycle of Irish mythology. We've got Crachor and his trusty advisor, the druid Cava, their scheming rival, Queen Maeve, there's a Cuchulainn-like figure in Rohan, who is eventually able to summon the Battle Fury armor with the war cry, well, Battle Fury, in what seems like a clear reference to the Ristrud, war spasm or battle frenzy. In the myths, the Ristrud causes Cuchulainn to nearly double in height and undergo other physical transformations during battle. There's also the heroine Deirdre, who in the show is Crachor's daughter. In the myths, it's more complicated than that, as Crachor steals Deirdre away from her family, but then she falls in love with the warrior Nisha, and long story short, it doesn't end well for him or her, and hence she becomes known as Deirdre of the Sorrows. In addition to starring in the original Ulster Cycle myth, Deirdre of the Sorrows became the subject of multiple stage plays and productions starting at the turn of the 20th century. There was George William Russell's, aka A.E.'s, Deirdre in 1902, another Deirdre from Yeats in 1907, J.M. Synge's Deirdre of the Sorrows in 1910, and who could forget Adrian Roland Holst's Deirdre an de Zonen van Ushnik from 1916. Yes, this mythical Irish character has international appeal. Irish mythology in general has international appeal, so it may come as no surprise for you to hear that George R.R. Martin likely borrowed from Irish mythology for his A Song of Ice and Fire books, the first of which, A Game of Thrones, was published in 1996. And of course, many of those mythical Irish details made their way over to the hit show Game of Thrones, which debuted in 2011. The most obvious, dare I say, gleaming homage to Irish mythology can be seen when Jaime Lannister, spoiler alert, gets his sword hand lopped off and has it replaced with a golden one, and then has to wrestle with his resulting loss of social status. In the mythological cycle, Nuada, the leader of the Tuatha Dé Danann, finds himself in a similar predicament when he gets his hand lopped off and has it replaced with a silver one, to each their own, and then has to wrestle with having his right to rule stripped away from him. What's more, Nuada possesses an enchanted sword known as the Clive Solish, the Sword of Light. An inspiration, perhaps, for one of Westeros' most talked about blades, the legendary Lightbringer. There are also cases to be made that Euron Crow's-Eye Greyjoy, who in the books wears an eye patch, is a riff on Balor of the Evil Eye, and that the Greyjoys in general are modeled after the Fomorians, as both are influential groups of rough and tumble marauders who reside in treacherous-looking island chains. The Children of the Forest, meanwhile, could be said to give off People of the Hills vibes. The People of the Hills, or Aishi, are fairies. This is who, or what, Yeats was referring to when he wrote, "The Tuatha Dé Danann, robbed of worship and offerings, grew smaller and smaller in the popular imagination until they turned into the fairies." End quote. The Aishi are the diminutive early inhabitants of Ireland, a supernatural race that precedes the arrival of humans and is ultimately forced to languish in relative obscurity in secluded locations adjacent to the lands that were once theirs. Or so the story goes. Both stories. And lest you think I'm reading too much into this, which, fair, George R.R. Martin also wrote the backstory for the video game Elden Ring, which, as you'll soon discover, is not only sprinkled with allusions to Irish mythology, but also features a character named after the semi-historical Irish king, Niall of the Nine Hostages. Which leads us to Bran from Game of Thrones / A Song of Ice and Fire, and to Bran of the Bloody Blade, and Bran the Builder, and Bran the Breaker, and Bran the Shipwright, and Bran the Burner, and Bran Ice Eyes, and Bran the Bad. Well, Irish mythology doesn't boast quite that many Brans, unless those are all the same Bran and he's been time traveling. What? There are several characters who bear that name, like Bran MacFowl, aka Bran the Voyager, Bran Fionn MacCool's faithful dog / nephew, I love Irish mythology, and Bran mac Lear, or Bran Son of the Sea, brother of Manannán mac Lear. There's also Bran the Blessed, of course, from Welsh mythology, brother of Manawydan fab Lear. Yeah, this Bran is a Welsh cognate of the aforementioned Bran mac Lear. And the name Bran? It originally meant crow or raven, how apropos. And Ellis suggests it was once used as a title for Celtic chieftains and kings, the Gaulish leader Brennus, who sacked Rome in 390 BCE, being an early example. Of course, before A Song of Ice and Fire could run, fly, The Lord of the Rings had to walk. Because arguably the works of J.R.R. Tolkien were based on Irish mythology as well. Someone left a comment on one of my videos recently asking how valid this idea is that Tolkien based his elves on Irish mythology's divine tribe, the Tuatha Dé Danann. I have made the argument before that when we look at Tolkien's elves, this gifted race of warriors and craftspeople who will come to abandon their homes in Middle-earth for the Undying Lands because the Age of Men is upon them, you can't help but see the Tuatha Dé Danann, who famously forge and wield super powerful weapons and who rule over the Celtic otherworld Tír na nÓg, the Land of Youth, and who are eventually replaced by the invading Milesians, who represent the arrival of Ireland's modern human population, this according to the Yaur Gawla Erin, or Book of the Taking of Ireland, commonly known as the Book of Invasions. Then there's the fiery Eye of Sauron, a symbol that begs immediate comparisons to Balor of the Evil Eye, the Fomorian warlord who I think of as the mythological cycle's big bad. To quote scholar Elizabeth A. Gray's translation of the Ka Moitura, or Second Battle of Moitura, Balor of the Piercing Eye had a destructive eye which was never opened except on a battlefield. 4 men would raise the lid of the eye by a polished ring in its lid. The host which looked at the eye, even if they were many thousands in number, would offer no resistance to warriors. End quote. Now, compare this to Tolkien's description of Sauron's eye in The Return of the King, published in 1955. Quote, "One moment only it stared out, but as from some great window immeasurably high, there stabbed northward a flame of red, the flicker of a piercing eye. And then the shadows were furled again, and the terrible vision was removed." End quote. Okay, it's not perfect, but we do know from a letter Tolkien wrote to a friend in 1951 that he used, quote, legends of other lands as literary, quote, ingredients, including those of the, quote, Celtic variety. And while Celtic can mean different things to different people, we don't have to get into all of that because we also know that Tolkien, after being invited to a site associated with Nodens, a god of the Celtic Britons, connected that god to the Irish Nuada of the Silver Hand. And that's how Tolkien came up with the name Celebrimbor for the elven smith who forges the Rings of Power in the Silmarillion. Celebrimbor meaning Silver Hand in Elvish. Regardless of how you feel about The Lord of the Rings or A Song of Ice and Fire containing nods to Irish mythology within their many pages, there's no denying the overall influence the written word has had on spreading Ireland's myths far and wide. Darby O'Gill, The Luck of the Irish, The Secret of Roan Inish, A Shine of Rainbows, The Watchers, Fairies, American Gods, these were all based on novels. And these days we have entire fantasy and romantic fantasy novel series that don't just dance around Irish mythology, but dutifully engage with it. Kevin Hearn's The Iron Druid Chronicles, Melanie Karsek's Celtic Blood series, Trisha O'Malley's Mystic Cove series, Nora Roberts' The Cousins O'Dwyer trilogy and the Dragonheart legacy, Karen Marie Moning's Fever series, Emma Hamm's The Otherworld series, Lee and Edwards' The Irish Witch series. These books have thousands and in some cases tens of thousands of positive ratings on Goodreads and Amazon. That being said, we can't overlook one-off Irish mythology-inspired novels, such as John Coyne's 1981 horror novel Hobgoblin, which features a riff on the historical Irish king Brian Boru, who appears in the King's Cycle, which is also known as the Historical Cycle, I should add. More recently, David Duchovny, yes, that David Duchovny, Duchovny, took the Ulster Cycle tale The Wooing of Emmer and set it in New York City with his 2018 novel Miss Subways. Then in 2020, we got the award-winning Deirdre Sullivan novel Savage Her Reply, a retelling of one of Irish mythology's most well-known stories, The Children of Lear, which is technically part of the mythological cycle but was likely an independent folktale first that was then recast with divine characters. This according to folklorist Joseph Jacobs's 1895 More Celtic Fairy Tales. Anyway, before inspiring Sullivan's innovative novel, The Children of Lear inspired a ballet in 1950, an opera in 1923, a poem in 1907, and a play in 1606 called King Lear that was written by some English fella named William Shakespeare. Of course, one of my favorite Irish myth-inspired novels is The Drumcliff Pilots by Kieran Devaney. And I'm not just saying that because my actual surname is the same as Kieran's, I pronounce it Devaney, or because I met Kieran one afternoon in 2009 on Ross's Point in County Sligo at a pub, and I went in there and the bartender was also a Devaney, and he called all of the other Devaneys down to the pub to hang out with me. Yes, this is the plot of that SNL skit with Paul Mescal. I actually lived it. And then my girlfriend, now wife, and I, we were walking back to our hostel in Sligo town, and it was pitch black, and we were on the side of the road, and then headlights come at us, and the car slows down, and we're kind of freaking out, but then the car door opens, and it's one of the Devaneys from the pub, well, his wife actually, who had come to pick him up, and they take their dog that was in the backseat of the car, and they put the dog in the boot, and they usher us into the backseat of their car, and they drive us to an Italian restaurant. What was I talking about again? Right. Books. And Irish mythology-inspired short story collections certainly fit into that category as well. Two of the most popular being the Celtic Mythology collection from Irish Imbas Press and Emerald Magic, published under the science fiction and fantasy imprint Thor, which features a story by Ray Bradbury. If only there were another Irish mythology-inspired short story collection I could mention here, maybe one that features contributions from 16 incredible authors and one stay-at-home dad who runs a YouTube channel. Ah well. In the Hellboy comic series, created by Mike Mignola, who it should be noted was also a writer on all of the Hellboy movies, we get direct references to deities in the Irish pantheon, the Tuatha Dé Danann, including the father figure and one-time leader of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the Dagda's son, the love god Angus Mac Og, and the occasionally crow-shaped goddess of battle, the Morrigan. There's also Queen Maeve, who in the myths isn't part of the Tuatha Dé Danann. She's a human queen and Cuchulainn foe from the Ulster Cycle, and if that name, Maeve, sounds familiar to you, well, there's Queen Maeve in the Mystic Knights of Tir na Nog, of course, but Queen Maeve is also a character in the comic-turned-streaming series, The Boys, where she's given the alias Empress of the Otherworld. And I'd be remiss not to mention that in The Boys series, Queen Maeve is played by the Irish actress Dominique McElligott. Now, there's no way we can have a conversation about Irish mythology's integration into comic book lore without discussing Thor. In 1987, the Mighty Thor issue number 386 introduced the Tuatha Dé Danann, which in the Marvel Comics is a mix of mythical Irish figures as well as figures from Welsh and Gaulish mythology. Hence, the group are also referred to by the umbrella term Celtic gods. Thor first squares off against Lear, who is dubbed the Lord of the Lightning, which, okay, I get the desire to have a thunder versus lightning face-off in a Thor comic, but in Irish, Lear translates to sea or ocean, and Ireland's chief god of the sea is Manannán Mac Lear, his surname meaning son of the sea. Granted, some iterations of Manannán position him as a conjurer of storms or even a physical manifestation of a storm, so I can't fault the writers for leaning into the lightning. Especially when you consider Marvel already had a popular god of the sea-esque character in Namor the Submariner. So maybe they didn't want Lear intruding on Namor's turf. No, that's not what I... Flash, Quicksilver, forward to the Mighty Thor issue 398, and the titular hero of Norse mythology is now joining forces with the bard and satirist Calbia, son of the Irish god of eloquence Ogma, and the Dagda, aka the Irish Allfather, Oha Olehe. And while these Thor books from the late 80s marked the introduction of the Tuatha Dé Danann into Marvel Comics as a fighting squad, some individual characters from Irish mythology had shown up before. Notably, both the Dagda and the Irish god of medicine, Dian Cecht, are name-checked in the 4th issue of Savage Tales featuring Conan the Barbarian from 1974. Then in 1980, in the 300th issue of Thor, a whole bunch of gods from different traditions are shown to be part of the Council of Godheads. There's the Aztec god god Tezcatlipoca, the Greek god Zeus, the Mayan god Itzamna, the Egyptian god Osiris, and who have we here? Irish mythology's very own Nuada of the Silver Hand. He's labeled as a Celtic god here, which is fine, but Gaelic god would have been better, or just Irish god, or for being technical, god of the Goidelic/Gaelic Celtic-speaking peoples of Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. Granted, given the context, this godhead Nuada could also be said to represent his cognates in other traditions, including Welsh mythology's Sinéad of the Silver Hand, and the older Celtic British figure Nodens, in which case Celtic probably is the best word, and this has been a huge waste of time. Speaking of a huge waste of time, Thor Love and Thunder, the 2022 comic book movie, depicts a council of godheads. But instead of giving us meaningful introductions to the different pantheons, the focus is on Zeus and his Olympians. Great, Greco-Roman gods, they definitely need more of a spotlight. In my head, I saw this movie going in a completely different direction, where Thor would have been actively recruiting gods from different pantheons to help him in his fight. So he'd go to Egypt to get Khonshu and Moon Knight, he'd go to the realm of Ta Lo to get that great protector dragon from Shang-Chi, and he'd go to Ireland and or the other worlds to recruit the Dagda, or Manannán mac Lear, or the Morgon, or Nuada of the Silver Hand, or Bo Derrig, or Brigid, or Lugh, or Angus Og, or Eru, or Dian Caicht, or Balor of the Evil Eye, or Aurine Gluniel. Granted, those last two are both enemies of the Tuatha in the myths, but whatever. And yes, I cast all of these already. Only this was years ago, before Paul Mescal was a thing. So let's just swap out one of those, or all of those, for Paul Mescal. Probably should squeeze Andrew Scott in there as well. On the DC side of things, the Amazonian princess Wonder Woman naturally, supernaturally, serves as Irish mythology's entry point into that universe. Specifically, in a popular The Brave and the Bold, Batman and Wonder Woman comic arc from 2018, Wonder Woman must travel to the Celtic otherworld, Tír na nÓg, the Land of Youth, to solve the murder of the King Alaha, who in Irish mythology is actually a Fomorian ruler, but who has a son with Ireland's namesake goddess Eru, and that son, Brest, becomes an unpopular ruler of the Tuatha Dé Danann following Nuada's behanding, which leads to the Second Battle of Moytura. It's a whole thing. Like the Marvel comics, however, DC casts a wide net around Irish mythology, catching Gaulish figures like the horned god Cernunnos in the process. Still, The Brave and the Bold does succeed in giving page time to Irish myth-inspired figures, including King McCool, a riff on the Fenian cycle warrior Fionn mac Cool, Balor Evil Eye, a riff on, you guessed it, Balor of the Evil Eye, and Enya, who in the myths is the daughter of Balor and the mother of Lugh. Enough about movies and TV shows and books and comic books, because everyone knows where Irish mythology is really flourishing is in video games. No, seriously. Case in point, Castlevania, which debuted in 1986 and eventually got its own animated series, not only includes an iteration of Ireland's legendary Headless Horseman, the Dullahan, but also features mythical Irish weapons such as Nuada's sword, the Clive Solish, meaning Sword of Light from the mythological cycle, and Fergus mac Roth's sword, Caladvolg, Hard Dinter, from the Ulster cycle. A quick aside, it's possible that the Irish Caladvolg inspired tales of the mythical Welsh sword, Caladvolk, which would be Latinized as Caliburnus and eventually anglicized as Excalibur. But I digress. In 1987, we got Final Fantasy, a franchise that famously features Fragarach, the Answerer, an enchanted sword wielded by Manannán mac Lear and his foster son Lugh in the mythological cycle, and which eventually ends up in the treasure bag of the Fianna in the Fenian cycle. It also ended up, shameless plug alert, in my Celtic fantasy anthology Neon Druid, thanks to author R.J. Howell and the short story Fragarach. Putting our swords aside, the Ga Bullig, a gruesome weapon known for its 30 seemingly spring-loaded barbs, also has a recurring presence in Final Fantasy. In the Ulster cycle, the Scottish champion Skaha teaches Red Branch warrior Cuchulainn how to throw the Ga Bullig with his foot while he's studying at her military academy. And it should be noted that in 2006's Final Fantasy XII, the Hound of Ulster himself, Cuchulainn, appears as a blueberry? Don't get me wrong, I actually think this is a, let me say, fun interpretation of the character, who in the myths absolutely turns into a giant rage monster from time to time via a process/superpower known as the Restrud, or War Spasm. The War Spasm phenomenon is perhaps hinted at in the 2022 game Elden Ring, specifically with the demigod boss character Malenia, who has two distinct presentations in battle. To quote Irish franchise and lore director Cian Maher, writing for Inverse, Malenia's second phase transformation could be interpreted as an extremely cool riff on legendary Irish hero Cuchulain's infamous Ristrud. End quote. George R.R. Martin, who was responsible for the game's world building, i.e. he wrote Elden Ring's backstory, didn't prioritize the names of Irish gods, monsters, and heroes so much as he did the actual mythical Irish concepts and stereotypes. As Mar noted, even characters with names from other etymological origins, like Melania, are distinctly Irish-coded. Her flowing red locks and prosthetic arm clearly reference Nuada Ergetlav. End quote. There's also a fire giant in Elden Ring that gives serious Balor vibes. The whole thing is set in the Lands Between, which feels like a reimagining of the Celtic Otherworld. What's more, the presence of Commander Niall, the great enemy boss, and his variant/descendant, Commander O'Neill, could be considered name checks of the semi-historical Irish king Niall Noy Yalek, Niall of the Nine Hostages of King Cycle fame, and the E. Neil dynasty that followed. Folklore from back in 2007 also deserves a mention, as the game features/uses the names of several mythical Irish weapons, including the Ga Derrig, red spear or javelin, and the Ga Bui, yellow spear. The love god Angus Og famously gifts these spears to his foster son Diarmid Ua Dovna, Diarmid of the Love Spot, who wields them to middling effect in the Fenian cycle tale The Pursuit of Diarmid and Grania. There's also the Tahalum, a projectile from the mythological cycle that is made from the blood of toads, bears, and vipers mixed with sea sand, and that is used by Lugh to slay his grandfather Balor. Then there's the fact that half of Folklore is set in a seaside village in County Clare, Doolin. I've been there. God, I'm such an American. While the other half is set in the Netherworld, a clear reimagining of the Celtic Otherworld. The game goes so far as to specify that the only time a person can cross over into the Netherworld is during Samhain. This mimics a trope we find throughout Irish mythology, where the veil between worlds is said to be thinnest on Samhain, and beings, human or otherwise, are wont to cross over. For an example, look no further than the Fenian cycle tale about Elaine MacMidna, the Burner, a fire-breathing goblin that crawls out of the cave of Cruachan every Samhain to wreak havoc on Ireland's royal seat of power at Tara. Of course, Irish mythology fans must have been smitten when Smite debuted in 2014, allowing gamers to play as the Morrigan and Cuchulainn and Ireland's Banshee Queen, Cliona. But looking at the sheer volume of mythical characters and weapons, no game has done as much to promote Irish mythology as Shin Megami Tensei, which debuted in 1992. I won't even attempt to name all of the references pulled from Irish and more broadly Celtic mythology, but here, have a look. Now, some of the non-gamers among you might be tempted to think, psh, these games don't count as popular culture, it's just a small segment of young people and nerdy old people who partake. To which I'd counter, well, I don't personally play video games or PC games, millions do. And running this channel, I hear from folks all the time who want to learn more about specific mythical Irish characters and or weapons they encountered while playing their favorite game. If this sounds like you, please leave a comment and help prove my point. I would love to end this video by playing in full The Sickbed of Cuchulainn by the Pogues. FYI, that song title is verbatim the title of an Ulster Cycle myth about Cuchulainn falling ill after trying to kill two otherworldly seabirds. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's the setup. However, since copyright restrictions prevent me from playing that song for you, let me just say that Irish mythology has certainly shown itself capable of influencing rock and pop. Thin Lizzy's 1979 song Black Rose, Sinead O'Connor's 1994 song A Perfect Indian, Hozier's 2023 song Swan Upon Leda, all of these make allusions to Irish myths and or mythical figures. And of course, Irish folk metal fans will already know that bands like Primordial and Cruachan dip their creative buckets into that mythical Irish well on the regular. Was that the least metal way possible I could have said that? Yes, it was. But did you know that Irish mythology has also left its stamp on the world of classical music? Maybe you haven't heard of John Coulter's 1944 operetta Deirdre of the Sorrows, or Robert Lamb's 1970 orchestral suite The Children of Lear, but I know you're familiar with John Williams. Yes, that John Williams. In 1995, he unveiled a new concerto, The Five Sacred Trees, a reference to the five sacred trees of Ireland as detailed in the Dean Henhash, or Lore of Places. By his own admission, Williams drew inspiration for the piece from the works of someone I mentioned way back near the beginning of this video, Robert Graves, son of Irish poet and folklorist Alfred Percival Graves. It's a great example of how interest in Irish mythology has been able to persist from generation to generation. The creative work of the former informing and inspiring the creative work of the latter. This is Peter Beresford Ellis's 1987 A Dictionary of Irish Mythology, which I found in Montreal in the 2010s at a used bookstore / cafe / music venue that was owned and operated by my good friend and co-worker, Tim. We worked at an Irish pub together, naturally. This dictionary, while imperfect, as evidenced by this seller's no-holds-bar, brutally honest blurb for it on Amazon, was my introduction not to Irish mythology in general, but to the fact that Ireland has its own pantheon of deities, something comparable to what the Greeks and the Romans and the Norse have, and it has the epic stories to match. Which leads me to another book, The Táin. This is Thomas Kinsella's now renowned translation of the Ulster Cycle story, The Táin Bó Cúailnge, or Cattle Raid of Cooley, published in 1969. But story is certainly the wrong word here. This is a saga, an epic. The Irish Iliad, it's been called. I found my copy of Kinsella's Táin a few years back at a free little library just 1 block away from my home here in San Jose. And while not everyone is going to be lucky enough to stumble upon a book that introduces them to all of these incredible stories and characters, hopefully they will be lucky enough to stumble upon a video. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and one of the best things you can do is subscribe. Got questions or comments? Do one of those super thanks thingies and you'll be guaranteed to get a response from yours truly. I've also got books and resources linked up for you down in the description, and there are plenty more videos to watch right here on the Irish Myths channel. As always, my name is I.E. Kneverday, editor of the Celtic fantasy short story anthology Neon Druid, and creator of IrishMyths.com. Thanks for coming out.